Somebody many years ago gave me this paperweight that I have in my office, and it's really just a stone, and written on it, it says, "Nothing is written in stone." I don't know if you can see that at home, but it's a strange statement, nothing is written in stone. I guess that's true since the invention of paper, because before that, we would write things in stone. And it reminds me, of course, of the statement of you should not create red lines. And then there is, of course, a similar statement, and that is that you shouldn't draw lines in the sand. All of those mean the same thing, essentially, and that is things ought to remain the way they are, and that there is a point by which you cannot return. Of course, it doesn't really make much sense with regards to drawing lines in the sand, because almost immediately when you draw a line in the sand, it either washes away or somebody can step on it, and it's pretty easy to wipe out a line that you have created in the sand. But it still means the same thing, and that is that we all reach a moment. We all have boundaries to what we decide we will accept and what we won't. And people all the time in their lives create these types of markers and boundaries. We create ultimatums. And whether we believe in them or not, we hope at least that people will respect those boundaries. And that when we say to ourselves, this is my line in the sand, it's very similar to the statement that dads all over the world and from the beginning of the invention of cars have been saying, don't make me pull this car over. Or, if I have to come back there. Now, whenever that happened, my kids would laugh at me because they knew full well I wasn't going to pull the car over, because there's nothing I wanted more than for that car ride to end. But we all know that we have breaking points, and each and every one of us have found a moment in our lives when we have crossed the line, when we have gone too far. Whether we call it a line in the sand or we call it the red line, the problem is most of the time, those lines, those boundaries we create are invisible. And we usually don't know that we have crossed it until we've crossed it. Wouldn't it be great if we could do an honest and ruthlessly truthful assessment of what our own lines are? Are they protection of family? Are they human dignity? We saw this week a display of extraordinary inhumanity to man when leaders use people as pawns. Is that a line that has been crossed in our society? Thankfully, those people were welcomed with open arms and were tended to with the utmost of human dignity. But is this a line that we have crossed in our society? There's a wonderful phrase in Hebrew that says, Meit alayich. And though it's hard to translate specifically into English, it roughly means, I die for you. I love you so much that I feel like I'm dying, that I would die for you. Meit alayich, it says, which is very different than what I often say to my kids, which is, you're killing me. Either way, we recognize the sacred value of human life, of holy people and ideas, And we recognize that each and every one of us has to learn to write those values for ourselves. In this morning's Torah reading, it says, "V'chatavta al ha'avanim et kol divrei haTorah hazot be'er hetev." Chapter 27, verse 8 of the book of Deuteronomy, it says, "And on these stones you shall inscribe every word of this teaching most distinctly." Be'er hetev, clearly, able to be read legibly. When you get into the land of Israel, when you have established yourself in the land and you have control of your own destiny, your own future, then you must write down clearly, without ambiguity, what you stand for. As the line made famously by the Broadway show Hamilton, though I'm skeptical that Alexander Hamilton ever actually said it, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. This idea I spoke of 2 weeks ago was that we have to rewrite our traditions and make them jibe with our modern sensibilities. I gave an example, cherem, saying that it used to mean in biblical days absolute destruction, absolute demolition. And then how we changed that to mean excommunication. Didn't mean to kill them, it just meant to push them out. This week I speak of the need to walk it back a little bit. There are things in our society, in our tradition, that cannot be crossed. There are values and morals that have to remain sacred no matter the time, no matter the place. And the Torah says, write them down. Now, 2 weeks before the high holidays, we have to do the same exact activity, and that is do a full accounting. And then I ask you, not on Shabbos, but other times, to write it down. Hold ourselves accountable if we have it written in front of us. Sometimes we write things down in order to remember them. We make a post-it note in order to remind ourselves to do something. But the act of writing itself is an act of committing something to memory. Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi, said, "V'chatavta al ha'avanim et kol divrei ha'ele kishenishbe'u ata behar grizim u'behar eval hayta Torah lifnehem k'tuva v'nishbe'u sheyikimuhu." Rashbam says you write it down in these locations in order to commit yourself to it, to promise you're going to stick by it. How many of us over the course of a year make resolutions that we fully mean to commit ourselves to, but over time we grow tired and those resolutions lapse? Shmuel ben Meir, Rashbam, says, write it down, but don't throw it away. Don't toss it away. Keep it as a reference tool. Check on how you're doing by making sure that you write it down. Writing things down help us clarify. Writing is therapeutic. Journaling is something our children are taught from an early age. I have a wonderful story about my youngest who came home from school one day and had a story about the boys in her class. I can't share it this morning from the Bima because it's a little off. Needless to say, she confused the word journaling with something that is used in a men's bathroom. If you got it, you got it. If you didn't, just ask me about it at Kiddush. I'll share the story with you. But long before it was common in primary schools to have journals, Moshe said to the Jewish people, write it down. And to paraphrase the Malbim, Meir Levush ben Yechiel, Michiel Wisser. Don't worry about the penmanship. The Malbim says as follows, K'tiva mifureshet ma'aseh yad uman. That writing it down just has to be clear enough. It doesn't have to be the work of an artist. We know, says the Malbim, that we're careful when we write down the Torah that we hire a specific individual who has a skilled set. We call that person a sofer. Aval aktiva hamsoretet lo hayta ktiva mehuderet. But in the past, it wasn't that way. In the past, each and every Jew was asked to write the Torah down for themselves, and it didn't really matter what their penmanship was. It only mattered that you could read it. That's why the verse ends, Be'er Hetev, that it should be legible enough that you should be able to read it. And so I ask you to do the same activity today. Write it down. Make it legible, not just for you, but for coming generations. Each and every one of us holds a place in our family structure. And each and every one of us is going to have to pass that down, whether we have children of our own or we are teachers of children, that they can refer to the values we held to be sacred. We need to write down in legible handwriting just enough so they can understand it, what we stand for, what we would die for. What are those values we hold to be sacred? I know that penmanship has gone the way of the world. Because of the advent of the personal computer, nobody really writes things anymore. Some of us make lists and notebooks, and some of us periodically will write a handwritten note, but for the most part, nobody really writes anything anymore. I'm happy for that because my scribbling is sometimes illegible. I'll refer back to a list that I have made and discover I have no idea what I was supposed to do. As you know, I have in my possession my father's notes. My father wrote constantly on paper and pen. My father always wrote with a flare pen. Remember those flare pens? Now, if you don't know anything about a flare pen, you'll know that the ink tends to bleed a little bit too much if you hold your finger on that spot. You hold the ink point on that spot for too long. And every year at this time of year, I go back to my father's notes about the high holidays. Every year I take out his machzor that is filled with little pieces of paper, notes that he wanted to say at a specific time during the service. And this year I did the same thing as I always do. Strangely enough, I found a sermon he wrote. I wrote a sermon this year called Seeing Those Who Suffer. And essentially, I'm going to give this away, but you'll know it as soon as we get to Rosh Hashanah. The sermon begins with the sounds of silence, the song by Simon and Garfunkel, because you know I like to sing. I found a sermon this year that my father wrote, and on the front of it, it said, "The sound of the silenced." It's a sermon completely different than the sermon I'm going to give, but to see his handwriting, scrawling those words, it was like him saying, "Jay, I got a different take on this." And the dialogue continues. So each year I go through these notes, and they are as distinct as his personality was. I could see him writing these notes at his desk with his desk light shining late into the night. I could feel him pressing his flare pen to the page. The notes are a combination of Hebrew and English, uppercase and lowercase letters, usually not where they're supposed to be, uppercase and lowercase letters. This combination of dots and dashes, underlines and crossouts, places where more ink was distributed as he paused to come up with the next right word. Or when he was developing an idea, you could see from the page how it was unfolding in his mind. And those notes, of course, are sometimes painful to read. And you can see where the pages on some of them are beginning to wear out. So I did something this year that I haven't done. And that is I scanned them into a document so that I could have the originals. And then what I did was I found a couple that I particularly enjoy and I transcribed them. And then I did something that I am proud that I'm going to continue to do for a long time, and that is I sent them to his grandchildren. The scan and the transcription. So they could see what their Zaidi really stood for and what was really all about in his life. In one note, he wrote in simple yet elegant comment introducing Kol Nidre. And I think very well this is a statement that should be written in stone. He wrote, "Welcome to the 25-hour forgiveness retreat. A fast loosens our ego boundaries and makes us more receptive to new truths and to each other and to God." If that's not something to stand by and stand for, I don't know what is. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184. It's introduced by the Chatzi Kaddish. Please rise.